This is the second section of gender-based violence. I had left off previously talking about several of the policies that have been enacted, particularly on college campuses. So I wanted to quickly review about sexual violence by women. And here are some bullet points. So similarly to sexual violence by men, most of the perpetrators are acquaintances, are people that the perpetrator knows. Rape and sexual abuse by females is predominantly, but not exclusively, against family members, intimate partners, and acquaintances. Law enforcement data indicates that the percentage of female sex offenders is smaller than those of male sex offenders. And some of the data that it was providing from 2000 is that 1% of those arrested for rape and 8% of those arrested for other sex offenses, not including prostitution. Gender stereotypes can make it difficult to imagine a dominant woman coercing or forcing an unwilling man to have sex. Men can achieve erections without sexual arousal. That's a big misconception, what people don't think about. Male victims feel constrained by gender expectations and may not view their experiences as abusive and may be reluctant to report for fear or of not being believed. When I was reading this section, it kind of took me back to a movie called Antwone Fisher. I'm not sure if any of you have seen those or seen this. It came out many years ago, and I believe Denzel Washington stars in it and a few other folks, but I just remember Denzel. But Antwone Fisher was one of those films that really took this head on, I think, because I had never really seen it in a film or in pop culture reference in this way. And the storyline was very moving. It was of a young man, Antwone Fisher, who really overcame a lot in his life. And Denzel Washington played his mentor, basically someone that Antwone had looked up to. And Antwone had a lot of the risk factors, had experienced a lot of the risk factors that we had mentioned, from coming from an abusive home, or being more or less neglectful because the parents weren't around, and his mom was, I believe she was incarcerated, and unfortunately was an addict, and he basically had to fend for himself and was in foster home and here and there, and really no one was looking out for him. And as a young man, he was being sexually abused by in the foster home he was staying in. It was the woman's older daughter, and he was, I believe, if I remember correctly, probably only around age 8, 9, or 10. And so the way that the film explores his difficult past, because he is a young man who's really paved a way for himself and worked hard and accomplished a lot of good things in his life, but it's one of those films where they have to kind of go back and deal with their past and look at healing. And so you could see some of the reflections of his younger life and what he had to endure. But I liked the film. I thought it was a really great film, and this section made me think of that. We don't think about that very much, just because the predominant narrative and the data obviously shows us that females are the main victims in a lot of circumstances, but we also have to remember that there are young boys and men that also experience these things. Okay, breaking the frame. So here is, in addition to what we had mentioned in earlier slides about changing the narrative, here we have a focus on perpetrators of sexual violence instead of survivors. So we've seen that with some groups where they're trying to help change the narrative, the language, the semantics, scenarios in the way that we address this, so it's not victim blaming, but we're putting the onus on the perpetrator. So anti-rape activists focus on messaging and language. They want to shift more than the rhetoric. For too long, the attention and the onus has been on potential victims, most of them women. To reproduce the risk of sexual violence, they tell women to avoid certain situations. So when you hear things like, don't go here alone, be in lit areas, those are the kinds of things that they were talking about, avoiding certain situations. Survivors have been blamed for their own victimization. They demand a shift to perpetrators and their behaviors. This, of course, doesn't mean women shouldn't abandon measures to reduce risks, meaning, right, those instructions are still helpful, and to be mindful of your surroundings. I think that's always a better way of stating it. And if you are going to be under any substances or you're taking part in any of that, safe spaces, safe crowds, and you are with people that you trust, that are going to take care of you if you're thinking about going into any of those risky behaviors. So I think those things are obviously all still very important, and just being aware of your surroundings and where you are. But this really is looking at, it points out that women's actions alone can never solve the problem of sexual violence, right? The responsibility must be on the potential perpetrators to change their behavior. All right, we have the role of sexual assault in culture. We have to be careful about how this is phrased. Again, the language is a little funny, but really it's looking at certain groups and the way that certain groups or societies or norms will function or not function. Sexual violence knows no boundaries. It's probably universal across societies, but its prevalence will vary from group to group. And here are some bullet points from the study of Peggy Reeves. And she studied this in two groups. One, I'm not going to go into too much detail of the different groups she studied, but I'm going to just pull a few of the things here that I think are poignant. She found in some cultural groups, quote-unquote, things that are rape-prone, and what she defined as rape-prone are areas versus those that are comparatively rape-free, by which she did not mean rape is entirely absent, but that it is both stigmatized and rare in some cultures or groups. Apologies for the typos everywhere. I thought this was corrected. Sometimes the transcripts can be funny because I don't type all of these out. I usually just have it by dictation, and then the transcripts are ready. All right, where did I leave off? So she later applied for her theory to college campuses and fraternities. This is one group she studied. There's a significant correlation between rape and overall position of women. Groups marked by equality between women and men, where women have significant power and authority, rape is less prevalent and more stigmatized. By contrast, groups that are marked by male dominance and female subordination, where dominant masculinity is defined by toughness and interpersonal violence, rape is more prevalent and normalized. So when we look at this term rape-prone cultures, what does she mean by that? Sexual violence is an expression of social ideology of male dominance. Culture plays an important role in expression of male sexual aggression. And if this is true, then strategies to prevent sexual violence must focus not only on the individual men who perpetrate, but also more broadly on cultures that condone or promote sexual violence as a man's right and a woman's burden. And there was also a comparison to Adrienne Rich's ideas. This was pointed out earlier on heterosexuality. So dealing with masculinity and femininity again. So what does heterosexuality, quote unquote, look like, or what kind of personalities are associated with that? And also on Judith Butler's idea of performativity, so the way that maybe behavior is looked at, how men are seen, or if men are seen more feminine than others, then what does that, how do people perceive that, and what do they react around that? Or performativity also went back to drag queens shows and or dressing in drag, not necessarily the shows, but just whether you're a female or a male or LGBT identified and you're dressing in these non-conformative gender ideals, right? for example, Jonathan, right, on Queer Guy, he freely wears dresses and heels, but yet he has his beard and long hair, and there's a mix. He's just very non-gender conforming. And so when you have these ideas of performativity, that's what Judith was mentioning, and how it's tied into this idea of heterosexuality, of male aggression, of male dominance versus femininity and subordination and other, I'm trying to think of gender ideologies. Okay, there we go. Here we also have a study from Jay Pesco. I think this is really interesting. They spent a year studying students in California high school and looking at their studies of research on masculinity and heterosexuality. So what defined all of these things? What was around these ideas? Young male students produce their masculinity and heterosexuality through ritualized repetition of hyper-masculine behaviors. So things like they were noting degrading young women, boasting of sexual exploits, calling other young men fags for the slightest perceived slips of masculine, hyper-masculine behavior. And we all know this. We all know this has happened whether we were in school or, experienced ourselves or family, or this is a very common thing, and we see it in also film and media. I remember this from the 80s. Actually, the film Pretty in Pink, not Pretty in Pink, what was it called? 16 Candles was on the other night. And I love that film. It's funny, but you can just see so many wrongs in that film as well that just wouldn't fly today. Racist stuff, and they use this word actually rather frequently, maybe once or twice in the film, but that's, of course, just not done today. Not right. So those who best conform to compulsive heterosexuality gain the greatest social status. So those who performed these ideas of masculinity did better than those who didn't, and were at the bottom of the high school social ladder. And they also had a term for it, right? Fag position. This is what the degrading and not only of young women but of other males. Fraternities and athletic teams they also looked at, and the bulk of the research found some male fraternities and sport teams are indeed at high risk for committing sexual violence, but not all. Among those that are more rape prone, members reported higher levels of sexual aggression and hostility toward women. They also had other characteristics like more male peer support for sexual violence. So they were more expressive and supportive in doing this, actually encouraging these dominant what was seen as hyper-masculine behaviors. And there's more in that comes from the book, but I just wanted to pull out some of the highlights. This is actually rather interesting. I want to make another note from the sports teams and fraternities. And I know some athletic programs are trying to do their best to address this because they know that what they're dealing with a lot of the young men, and aggression and competition, and there's just a lot of that. Everyone will say it's just a bunch of testosterone, which may be, but also correcting that behavior and putting yourself in check. And you're still dealing with hypermasculine dominant behaviors when you know and well know that these male players also may identify LGBTQ or may be gay, but they're not out. So you're dealing with all of these different levels, and how do you go with the group, or how do you try to conform, or do they just let you be the person who you are? And so I remember having a student several years ago who was part of I want to say UND hockey or maybe UND football. But what I appreciated about this young man contributing to the conversation that we were having was that within their locker room and their teams, they would have these candid conversations because it was a point of the staff to make it very visible during this time. I don't know if they still do it, but when he was there, they would definitely have, especially other young men or other men that they respected, and come in and talk about these things and really kind of hopefully tamper down on this behavior of dominance and hypermasculinity, or at least addressing it's okay to be who they are and they don't have to prove to one another to do X, Y, or Z. And so I know some of the athletic programs are trying to do that, but also really address the issue head on with what is sexual violence, what is rape, what is not okay, and looking at their own behaviors. So this was one instance he was telling me about a speaker they had brought in, and similar to Kat's video in the beginning of the semester, I had you guys watch. I guess this speaker of theirs was really making it a point to put the onus on these young men to think about their role in sexual violence and rape, and how can they help prevent, how can they are a part of it, and changing the language, right? So it's not always on the victim, which will most likely be female. So I thought that was actually rather interesting. I don't know where it went. Hopefully it's still going on in most athletic programs. Let's see what else. Okay, advocates campaign against sexual violence. So similarly, when we're looking at a historical context of these things just don't happen out of thin air, right? It's many years of different people that are working hard on issues and really laying the groundwork. Published Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape. And the thing about this piece, it really brought out to the forefront when I had mentioned this being a private matter back in the day, and really pulling it out to the public view. And a lot of people responded to this writing. And so it examined cultural constructions of rape. The book was central to the growing feminist critique of rape, right? The onus on the victims versus the perpetrators, and they're trying to change that. Also, just the mindset of the way women were viewed who were victims. It explicitly linked the problem of sexual violence to male privilege. It put women's experiences of sexual violence at the center of a new political analysis of rape. People were able to share their experiences, which really hadn't been done so much publicly before. It featured as a second wave of feminism in the U.S. So in addition to the voting rights and everything that we learned earlier on, there's these different waves in feminism under the theories, and so this is one of the second waves of feminism. Women began speaking publicly and renouncing rape. Grassroots women's groups started developing, which they never really had before, and I think this is really important. You started the founding of rape crisis hotlines. That was one of the firsts during this time period. In 1976, 1976, they opened 400 rape crisis centers. They were critical police and healthcare responses, so they were trying to address it from a multi-pronged approach, and these two are very critical, right, in the very beginning when victims have to deal with these crises. It called for sweeping changes through the 70s. It called for training in the areas of special assault teams on the usage of rape kits, encouraged self-defense classes, and we hear language like Take Back the Night and the marches and the events that surrounded that. Some groups will still do that today, but it's shifted. It's a different time period and where people are focusing their efforts, but this helped launch those ideas. Women of color called attention to the intersections of gender, race, and sexual violence. So there's some examples, but this is where we'll find a lot of writers like Angela Davis and Alice Walker who are writing and speaking about these issues. Chicana activists focused on services for Spanish-speaking communities, and there was a bilingual hotline first established in East LA around the same time of the rape crisis centers. And with Native American women activists speaking out throughout the American Indian movement, and even back then they were still arguing about, not arguing, that's a weird word to say, but debating with police and healthcare workers and policy people and elected officials about state, federal, and tribal laws, and jurisdiction was still very much an issue back then. So those are just a few of the communities, but we see now, some of the focus has shifted, but all of these groups are still very evident and working hard to address all of these issues. Let's see, think about the structures of rape. This is very good to think about as well. So U.S. and British laws derive from historically viewed rape of white women, These, I need to check. The spelling. All right, historically viewed rape of white men. Those deemed sexually innocent. So remember this from earlier in our talks about how the patriarchal view and where it was coming in from England and the laws that influenced U.S. laws. It was a crime against property if you raped a white woman, and taking it back to those coverture laws, being the property of her father or her husband. Women of color were deemed fallen and found virtually no protection under these laws. And also, right, there was slavery, there was indentured servitude, there was a lot of colonization happening there in this period. So people that were not white really were not included in any of these rights or any of this picture. So when we look at the structures of rape law today, where are they coming from? They're coming from these old British laws, which helped find a lot of the U.S. laws. Think about the anti-miscegenation laws as well. So intermarrying between races was against the law, and what happened if you were found to be in a relationship willingly. In southern and western states, consensual sex relations between black men and white women could be considered rape. In 1973, the National Organization for Women, or NOW, created a rape task force to advocate for change to state rape laws. And if you remember some of those state laws from a few slides back, they were pretty horrendous by today's standards. It's been improved before, but it's still deeply flawed. So, for example, there's still placed a high burden of proof on rape victims without parallel for other crimes. This is coming from Zanday's work. To prove rape required the corroborative testimony of witnesses, proof of the overwhelming force on the part of the perpetrator, proof of utmost resistance on part of the victim. And none of this was easy to get, as you can imagine, even in current standards. None of this was easy to fulfill in the majority of cases. A rape victim was often blamed for her own victimization and subjugated to brutal scrutiny of her prior sexual history in court and the media, and we continually see this throughout today. Prior history of the accused could not be introduced in the courts on grounds that could prejudice the jury. This was a clear double standard. And it wasn't until the 1980s that U.S. jurisdiction did not recognize rape within marriage. This is a big one. 1980s. As late as 1999, North Carolina and Oklahoma still enabled defendants to use marriage to the victims as an absolute defense against rape. All the way up until 1999, this was allowable under the laws. In 1988, Mississippi became the last state to stop stipulating statutory rape was not real rape if the girl... Let's see, what else do we have in the book? But you can see that the laws from the beginning were the founding. I think this is really important to remember. And there's a lot of work today to change this. Again, to give you an example of these laws, anti-miscegenation laws, this viewpoint of patriarchy, and coverture laws that didn't fit for most women of color anyway. And so now you're dealing with all of these things that were left out and, weren't dealt with back then. Today, what do we have? Corroboration is no longer required. We have things called rape shield laws that limit the evidence of a defendant and what they're allowed to admit to trial about a victim's sexual history. Marital rape, that idea, that law has been abolished, so we can't use that as a defense. Rape laws are now more sexual neutral, and definitions of rape are broader, including acts beyond penile penetration of the vagina. There's obviously other ways that this definition is being updated. Challenges do still exist, though, and what are they? There's little uniformity on how to define rape, which makes counting rapes and countering and even discussing the issue difficult. Many states still require proof of physical aggression on the part of the perpetrator and a resistance on part of the victim for the crime to be considered rape. This, of course, is in regards to the most serious legal designation and eligible for heaviest penalties, so things that are really extensive in terms of the charges. Forced sexual assault remains difficult to prove, and prosecutors are often hesitant to bring charges. As a result, many survivors of sexual violence remain reluctant to report. Exceptions in rape shield laws often fail to protect survivors. Whether a rapist that is brought to trial and convicted depends largely on perceptions of the victim's quote-unquote innocence. So there's still this viewpoint attached. Survivors who are seen as engaging in unacceptable sexual behavior and those who are from marginalized communities, this is also part of that race and discrimination piece that comes into it, are less likely to seek or receive justice. Today, the focus is on challenging rape culture, victim blaming, and slut shaming. We have violence against members of LGBTQ communities and individuals. And what are some of the risk factors that are found? There's a high rate of crime property that usually is right alongside the violence that occurs, and there's a connection. In a national sampling of 18 and older individuals that identified as lesbian, gay, and bisexual, 20% of the respondents reported having experienced a personal or property crime in their lifetime motivated by their sexual orientation. Half reported being verbally harassed. 1 in 10 said they have been a victim of employment or housing discrimination. Gay men being significantly higher or more likely than lesbians and bisexuals experience violence and crime to their property. Gay men being significantly more likely than lesbians and bisexuals to experience violence and crime property. Men are more likely than women to be victims of violent crime in general. That we know, especially committed by strangers, men in general. Most crimes are perpetrated by heterosexual identified men who tend to hold more hostile attitudes toward male versus female sexual minorities. Gay men may be more visible targets, particularly if they frequent gay-oriented venues like gay bars. Another study found that lesbian and gay men of color experience more frequent violence compared to white lesbians and gay men. Intersectionalities. Just a few. There's a few more that are listed, but I wanted to give you some of the major highlights. For transgender community, there's little research, but they did report on some smaller studies, and here are some of those results. 60 to 91% of transgender people reported having experienced violence and or harassment in their lifetime. Elevated rates of violence globally. They were giving some indication of other countries around the world, in addition to South American countries and the Middle East. So, for example, in several South American countries, more or less these two that they were pointing out, Buenos Aires and Argentina, there have been execution-style type of punishments to transsexual persons and cross-dressers in large numbers. And the police in other countries harass, torture, and murder transgender persons with little consequence. There are high levels of aggression of anti-transgender violence, a desire to deface and mutilate the bodies of transgender people because they challenge the normative worldview of the perpetrator with respect to gender. So this is at higher rates than just, I guess you would say, a mainstream person that did not identify. Part of a continuum, violence against poor and disenfranchised. Viviane, in her study, was really looking again at other risk factors that should be looked more in depthly and looking in terms of solutions, because trans folks face a lot of high rates from discrimination of housing and unemployment, healthcare services, and so that puts them in a lot more vulnerable position. And so what she was saying, as part of this, we have to look at other things like employment and what is these underlying issues of poverty and discrimination against housing. So many trans people are poor. A significant number work as prostitutes, particularly trans women of color. And violence against trans people should be examined within the context of violence against the homeless, street vendors, and street prostitutes. She also argued against the neglecting the specificity of trans people's lives and cautioned against placing transgender women and transgender men on the same gender continuum. So even looking at these different aspects, you have to take it even further and look at them from transgender and specifically male and female points of views, because it's going to be different. So this kind of goes back to the conversation. There's no solution. There's no one right solution. Let's see. Anti-LGBT violence and hate crimes. So we have an understanding. Crime motivated by sexual orientation is considered a hate crime. And what is a hate crime? Hate crime, by the legal definition, criminal offense against a person or property motivated in whole or in part by offenders biased against a race, religion, disability, ethnic origin, or sexual orientation. And in 2009, sexual orientation was added with the passage of Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. I didn't get a lot of time to talk about these two cases, but they are very important in the part of movement and policy building within the LGBT community. Hate crime legislation varies from state to state. All hate crime statutes recognize bias-motivated crimes, affect not only the victim, but indirectly the entire class of the people targeted. Hate crimes motivated by perceived sexual orientation of the victim are a manifestation of sexual stigma. Reminder of what sexual stigma is: a society's negative regard for any non-heterosexual behavior, identity, relationship, or community. A system through which homosexuality or bisexuality is denigrated, discredited, and socially constructed as invalid relative to heterosexuality. Remember what sexual stigma is. There's clear ties that such violence to heteronormative practices. So practices that denigrate same-sex relationships. So people think that these same-sex relationships are wrong or unnatural, or they emphasize rightness or naturalness of heterosexuality. So these are where those ties of violence come in, because there's this really strong belief of heteronormative practices. Anti-LGBT violence is meant to punish gender nonconformity and preserve traditional gender binary systems. It is rightly categorized as gender-based violence. A few of the effects, there are a lot more, but we can gather from this violence how much stress it puts on the individual and the community. So we have things that are similar to people of color and experiencing race and discrimination. There's greater psychological stress. Because all of this hate and violence and behavior is being directed at the core aspect of identity of a person, right, of an individual. It reinforces the adherence to normative gender behaviors in people across sexual orientation and gender identity because of fear of being perceived as gay or lesbian. It renounces open expression of their gender identity. So this repression, you can think about all kinds of behaviors and ways this can affect an individual if they can't be who they are. Can you imagine checking everything that you do, you say, how you look every day of the week, your whole life, or for years, because you're fearful of what people are going to do or say to you? And so this renunciation, and you can put that in many scenarios across the LGBTQ community, but also with just people of color. God, let me get some more water here. And how that stress can be put on individuals and communities. It invokes a sense of fear that percolates throughout. Makes it extremely difficult to secure basic life necessities, housing, work, and healthcare. And there's a call for more research being needed. These are just a few of the big effects. Let me take a break here and I'll be right back. The last two topics I want to cover is just some information about stalking and cyber stalking, especially this day and age with everybody being online. I think cyber stalking is something to definitely be aware of. But stalking, what is that? Let's look at what it's defined as and what it means. So it's a pattern of repetitive, intrusive, and intimidating behaviors toward a specific person that causes the target to feel harassed, threatened, or fearful. And this affects approximately 16% of women and 5% of men in the U.S., or this is how many folks in the U.S. experience it in their lifetimes. It's thought to be more prevalent among college undergraduates. They found data from about 20% of undergraduates being stalked. Women comprised approximately 80% of the stalking victims. The majority are perpetrated by men. Most stalkers know their victims, so similar to many of the other behaviors we had talked about. Stranger stalking is the least common form. And we have to remember that when we're trying to debunk myths about rape or sexual violence or many of these other harmful behaviors, is people are always thinking of the boogeyman or the stranger is going to do this or that. But we have to remember the acquaintance factor, and that most of the perpetrators know their victims. The duration of stalking increases. The perpetrator and the victim it increases when they know each other, but also more so that when they're involved in an intimate relationship. By 2000, all 50 U.S. states and the federal government outlawed stalking, along with several other countries. And similar to rape and other sections of sexual violence, definitions can vary by jurisdiction and state. Most statutes include physical and electronic stalking, also known as cyber stalking. And what is this? What's cyber stalking? This pretty much in the form via computer, phone, or other technology, causing the target to feel harassed, threatened, or fearful. Often accompanies other forms of stalking. The number of women who stalk is relatively small, and female stalkers have been found to be less threatening and less violent in general than male stalkers. Among the female stalkers, oh yes, in the research it said it was more directed toward at celebrities and acquaintances rather than former intimate partners. However, they are found to be more violent than women who stalk non-intimates. Men who report female stalkers to police are often met with indifference, skepticism. Oh, textual harassment, that made it in there as well. So some of these you may know of other people, or maybe yourself has experienced this. This is, you can take a toll. It takes a toll anywhere of your behavior. your mind, your psychological stress. And so the other part of this, I think, which is important to understand, is with cyber stalking, this is also seen more of a private matter, and so there's less reporting of this, or if it's done with more younger folks, that they don't really report it to parents or other authorities, and so these can really escalate, and so we have to be mindful of. I know there was a section that they talked about parents just checking in with students, checking in with their kids from time to time, and what they're doing and what's happening, especially when it comes to online behaviors. Text sometimes hundreds in the course of a day to harass or to threaten, and also seen as the private nature friends and family may not be aware. Consequences from stalking or cyber stalking, but mostly stalking. There's the threats of death, serious psychological tolls, anxiety disorders, depression, and even post-traumatic stress disorder. All right, quick review. What do I have here? Oh, just a sentence. There's a lot more, obviously, because there was so much in this section with regard to gender-based violence, but I'll give you some time to review that, and I'll go ahead and end this section here.